It's important that I be here today to address this audience because it is a topic that I and the Asia Society are deeply committed to. As President and CEO, I've directed the institution to take a leading role in speaking out against all forms of racism and hate, and those particularly targeted against Asian Americans, as well as other communities. We have a moral imperative to make a difference. Back in 1956, John D. Rockefeller III founded this institution to build bridges of understanding. Since then, the Asia Society has been committed to intercultural understanding. Today, that mandate is more important than ever. We will use our platform in any way possible to stand in absolute solidarity with the Asian American community and to stand against racism in any form against any group in American society. Recently, I moderated a discussion with two Asian American alumni of Asia Society's Asia 21 network of young leaders on what can be done. And I learned a great deal from them. I look forward to learning more today from our speakers, all of whom are on the absolute front lines of fighting racism today, day in and day out. Our US-based centers are located in some of the most diverse cities in the country. We're in New York, we're in Los Angeles, we're in San Francisco, we're in Houston, and of course we're in Washington, D.C. It's fitting that today's program is hosted by two of these centers, Texas and Southern California. A year ago, both centers hosted programs at the early stage of the dual pandemics, that is, COVID-19 and the other pandemic, racism against Asian Americans. The Southern California Center pivoted from hosting their annual gala to instead holding the first of this now three-part series on standing against racism in the time of COVID. The Texas Center hosted a powerful conversation with a Stop AAPI Hate co-founder, Dr. Russell Jeung, who is again with us today. Before we move on to that conversation, we'll first hear from Wai-Ping Sun, chair of the Houston Center, who'll share a few brief remarks. In addition to her role as chair of the board of directors of the Asia Society Texas Center, Ping is deeply involved in the Houston philanthropic community, and I admire her work greatly. She serves on a number of boards, including Rice University's Shepherd School of Music and the Kinder Institute of Urban Research, as well as the Baker Institute Roundtable, the Texas Children's Hospital, Teach for America in Houston, the Barbara Bush Houston Literacy Foundation. And then there's the Chinese Community Center, among many, many others. When I think of Ping, I think of philanthropy and giving back writ large. So I now turn it over to you, Wai-Ping Sun.
Thank you, Kevin. We are really honored to partner on tonight's program with our colleagues in Southern California. It is befitting for us to have this event tonight, as today marks the 139th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Sadly, 139 years later, we are still fighting racial discrimination. Nowadays, news and videos circulating online are ubiquitous, with examples of physical and verbal attacks on Asian Americans. In particular, the video of Vilma Carey, a 65-year-old Asian American woman, being assaulted in New York, while bystanders closed their doors a few feet away, has stayed with me. The closing of doors on Asian Americans and many other groups is not new, but the increased attacks have spurred anxiety, fear, a sense of loss and belonging with the Asian American community. Asia Society worldwide and our center in Houston is a welcoming place that opens our doors to friendships and provides a place of belonging. Our work is needed more now than when we were founded 65 years ago. We have a critical role to play as our mission is rooted in the educational and cultural development of our community, trusting in the power of art, dialogue, and ideas to combat bias and build bridges of understanding. Houston is the most ethnically diverse city in the US and a majority and minority city, which is home to 7% of Asian American residents. Houston, viewed as a microcosm of the whole country, is evolving and adding a new dimension to the strength of the city. We are very lucky to call Houston home, where there is a shared belief that we are resilient. There is strength and beauty in diverse perspectives and people. We remain steadfast in our commitment to being an inclusive and welcoming place. And we condemn any form of racism towards any community and ethnicity. We hope tonight's program will build on advancing our mission, goals, and objectives. This is part of our COVID-19 series, and this is the 21st and final program of the series. So while it is end to the series, it is just the beginning of our work ahead, as it is an urgent call to action and an opportunity to learn about what people and organizations can do to combat the ongoing acts of racism and xenophobia. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for tonight's program. Connie Cheng-Jo is the Chief Executive Officer of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles, the nation's largest legal and civil rights organization for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Now over to you, Connie.
Thank you so much, Ping. I appreciate that. I'm going to jump right into the questions now to our panelists. First one is for Amra. Amra, over the last year during this pandemic, we've seen you go from covering the story to being the story, where you've shared your personal experiences and opinions as an Asian American. What brought on this change in that role?
Well, I can tell you it wasn't intentional. As a journalist, you're not used to becoming the story. You're used to being on the sidelines and covering the story. But I think the situation was really unavoidable. And I think that a lot of my Asian American colleagues in the media would say the same thing. And that's because it has a lot to do with the severe lack of Asian American representation that we see in the media. And as tragic as the circumstances have been, I saw it as an opportunity to create awareness about the invisibility of our Asian American people. And I really did feel such a strong burden on my shoulders to make sure that I was effectively and accurately covering my community. I mean, so many people, I'm sure you guys have the same experience. When you talk to non-Asian people in this country, they are surprised about some of the racism and discrimination and the microaggressions that many of us deal with on a regular basis. And I thought it was important for me to be out there and say, look, just because I'm on TV doesn't make me immune to a lot of the racism that we've been seeing and hearing about. And also the fact that racism, Ping was talking about this, it's deeply rooted in American history, and that's not taught in our schools. Asian American history is American history. Going back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there's been just systematic racism against Asians that people just don't know about. So, and I think perhaps because of this invisibility of our group, it might make us more vulnerable, may give the perception to the aggressors that, hey, I'll get away with it because they are simply the other. They simply don't matter. So, I found myself too, Connie, giving commentary, often being asked to give commentary, to give context, to these stories. And again, I simply couldn't just report, on these stories that we were, doing, especially about the Atlanta spa shootings where 8 people were shot dead. And I found a lot of moments where I did get emotional talking about my personal experiences, and that garnered a lot of reaction, a lot of it positive. I think people, again, were surprised that this is part of the Asian American experience in America. Another thing I want to mention too, Connie, is I think with this rising or this wave of hate against Asian Americans in this country, I think this served as a huge wake-up call to so many newsrooms across America. Many executives and bosses realizing, my gosh, we don't have enough Asian American representation. How are we going to cover the story sensitively? How are we going to navigate the cultural nuances of this story? How are we going to make sure that we have the right reporter on the story? How will this reporter get access to the families when we know that a lot of them will probably have language barriers? And as many of us know, as some of us are children of immigrants to this country, or maybe you're not, maybe you're 3rd or 4th generation, but we are very aware of how our parents and our grandparents were treated when they arrived to this country. They were diminished, they were denigrated, they were seen as a perpetual foreigner, or not even seen as human because they don't speak English well, they speak with an accent. And, that was the first thought I had when I arrived on scene to cover the Atlanta spa shootings. I knew immediately that these families are not only dealing with the grief and the horror of losing their family members, but also dealing with the challenges and the obstacles of talking and communicating with the officers, when they arrived on scene. And of course, with this ongoing investigation, which it's not over. So, I think it's a wake-up call for our communities, for us to speak out. It's a wake-up call to the media in general and how much we cover the Asian community. And at the end of the day, a lot of people have asked me, well, do you think it's fair that, you as an Asian American woman is covering these kinds of stories? And I say, absolutely. Sure, I am a journalist, but I'm also Korean American. I'm Asian American. I'm American, and I'm human. And all of these characteristics about me enhance my storytelling as a journalist.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Russell, since starting Stop AAPI Hate just over ago, tell us what is the current state of racism and its impact?
Yeah, thanks, Connie, and thank Asia Society for hosting us. I'm honored to be with this panel. Today, we actually issued another report from March last year to the end of March of this year. We've received 6,600 incidents of hate. So this is across the nation. They're horrific, palpable, terrible stories of how Asians are facing the fear and anger directed towards them, the scapegoating of the pandemic against them. And, our reports are just the tip of the iceberg. The Pew Research Center just found out in a national survey, 45% of Asian Americans experienced direct racism last year. That's over 8 million people across the nation have experienced direct racism. And, we've seen how the impacts have been deadly, especially to our elders and what happened in Atlanta and Indianapolis, but they've had other impacts as well. On our mental health, Asian Americans are the racial group most mentally having the most mental health issues during the pandemic. When we asked our respondents, what's your greatest stressor during the pandemic? Our respondents say overwhelmingly racism. Think about that. Asian Americans are more fearful about other Americans' hate than they are about a pandemic that's killed 500,000 people. That's how traumatizing this racism is. That's how widespread it is. That's how deadly it is. That's how worried we are about our elders. So the impact has been on our mental health. The impact of racism has been on our economics. People, because of racism, were avoiding Asian businesses. And even before the quarantine, Asian American businesses shut down. And as a result, large numbers of our working class community, low income service sector communities, they were laid off. So Asian Americans have the second highest rate of unemployment. So, like the others have said, there's historic roots to this racism, and there's going to be historic consequences of the racism those last 2 years. It's going to take us a long time to recover, both in terms of our mental health, in terms of our economic recovery, and in terms of just feeling safe and a sense of belonging in America.
Great. Thank you, Russell. Okay, this has been really heavy. I need a little bit of brightness now. So, Katrina, let's turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit more about Compassion in Oakland? Tell us how it got started and why and what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Connie. And thank you to the Asia Society for hosting us. Compassion in Oakland was created in early February, right before Lunar New Year, in response to the uprise in violent attacks against elder Asians, specifically in the Bay Area. As a Filipino, Chinese, Asian American, I recognize that racism against the Asian community is not new, but I was devastated, like many of you, to see the videos of attacks on Visha, Ratanapakdi, Pak Ho, and countless others that look like my grandparents, look like my parents, look like me. And especially in such a diverse place like the Bay Area, I knew I had to take action in some way. One of the founders, my good friend from college named Jacob Azevedo, posted on Instagram volunteering himself to walk with anyone who was feeling unsafe. I, along with the other co-founders, felt so compelled to be a part of the solution. And this quickly turned from a one-man operation to a nonprofit organization with over 2,000 volunteer applicants, 500 onboarded chaperones, and we have been able to serve over 100 community members of all ages, not just elderly, within the last 3 months. We've expanded our organization with Compassion in San Gabriel Valley down in Southern California, and we're really excited to announce that we will be launching Compassion in San Francisco in the upcoming weeks. None of us could have expected Compassion in Oakland to have such a major impact, and it's been incredibly humbling and empowering to experience this and to have so many individuals show us support and show up for the AAPI community.
That's fantastic. And I'm so glad to hear that you're expanding to San Gabriel Valley and San Francisco and other parts. B, could you tell us what you've been doing in Atlanta to advocate for Asian Americans during this pandemic, and particularly for Asian American women since the Atlanta mass shootings?
Well, when Amra was speaking, I felt really connected to a lot of what she was saying. And when this happened in Atlanta, I think all of us were very shocked because of the gruesome nature of what happened. And as we learned more, every detail we learned about, it became even worse. And representation is very important. As one of the few AAPI elected officials in Georgia, I had to bear a lot of the responsibility, and I felt it was really critical for me to step up and take as many opportunities as I could to talk to the media, because I did not want it to be framed from the perspective of people who don't understand the nuances of the AAPI community. And in fact, Amra and I met because she came over to my house and she did a segment with me on my front porch. And I told her, you know, I'm really glad you're here. It's so rare that I get to talk to AAPI journalists, even though there are so many stories about Georgia emerging after the 2020 November election where people would talk about the AAPI turnout, and the journalists who interviewed me just didn't get some of the cultural specificities, as well as the nuance of language barriers and the just diverse history of Asian Americans in this country and the way in which our parents migrated. And there was just so much missing and just sort of a disconnect in a lot of ways. And I found that I had to constantly explain myself to people. When Amra came over, we had a sidebar chat and we continued to stay in touch throughout this whole time. And I remember very clearly, I didn't get to express a lot of emotion during this time because we were doing rapid response with community members. There was a legislative side of it, like being front facing in the Georgia General Assembly and making sure that we were talking about the history of AAPIs in this country and highlighting that this is not a new thing. And this stemmed from something very systemic that where we see the intersections of xenophobia, misogyny, racism, gender-based violence, all of those things converging into one. And it was a really, really painful time. And there are so few of us in the Atlanta area that I didn't get to take a breath. I didn't get to process my own grief. I was I was very angry at the way that law enforcement in Cherokee County characterized what happened. I was very angry at the way in which some of the victims were being disparaged. And I was very vocal about calling this a hate crime. And as a result, I received messages from people who proceeded to call some of the women names. And I couldn't wrap my mind around, I think I couldn't wrap my emotions around why that would be the response after such a horrific crime took place in which the victims were just brutally executed. And we had the opportunity to meet with the president and the vice president when they were in town, and they changed a portion of their trip to meet with the AAPI delegation and some of the community leaders. And in that room, there were probably 10 or 12 of us. For the first time, we were hearing from the victims' families through some letters that were written and read to the president and the vice president. And one of the letters was written from the perspective of, it was written by one of the victims' children, but written from the perspective as if he was speaking for his mom. And it was a very emotional moment. And it was the first time I had cried throughout all of this happening. And I felt really embarrassed, right? I felt like I wasn't able to contain my emotions in a moment where I felt like I needed to be advocating for our community in front of the two most powerful leaders in our country. And I called Amra on the way home and I said, Amra, I just started crying. And it was the first time that I expressed any emotion around this besides anger. And I was really embarrassed about it. And she shared with me that she had just done a segment and she had gotten emotional as well. And I went on to watch that segment. And it was really powerful for me to see, because in all of this, as community advocates, as elected officials, as journalists, we oftentimes don't allow ourselves to process what has happened, even though it impacts us in a very deep way. And so I have learned to detach myself from all of these things pretty well. But in that moment, when I was hearing, these words from the victims' families, and we knew so little about the victims' family. And I think that also talks about that. I mean, that speaks to the invisibility and how they were overlooked and how they weren't connected to our communities in ways that many of us are. It took several days to learn the victims' names. And finally, we were hearing something from their family members who are grieving and asking the media not to call their mothers sex workers or prostitutes or whatever people were saying, and asking people to respect the privacy of their families. And, I think all of that just really speaks to how the lack of representation it reflects in the way that stories are told. And so in the aftermath, I've talked to a lot of journalists, and even, as I'm talking to them about something completely separate related to the Secretary of State run, all of them are having these sidebar conversations with me and asking me, what's going on with the AAPI community? I'm sorry we got it wrong. Is there anything you want us to know? How are people feeling? And that's, there's just a lot to process with that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, just hearing you talk about the letter started making me feel emotional. And so thank you to you and to Amra and other advocates for allowing people and giving us as Asian Americans permission to have emotions and to express our emotions, because this is not an easy time for all of us. Amra, for you, the question is, what more could the media be doing to support the Asian American community, as well as other communities of color in this fight against racism?
Connie, before I address that, I would love to just piggyback off of what B was saying, because that really was a powerful moment. Because, you know, when B and I spoke on the phone, I had called her to get a comment. You know, right, I had just gone on the air, and I had gotten emotional unwittingly, and I had called her to get a comment from her regarding the meeting that she had with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. And she ended up sharing with me that she got emotional. I said, that's funny, because probably around the same time I was getting emotional on TV, and I'm so embarrassed by this. And it was a really cathartic moment, I think, for the two of us, because I think we felt like, okay, maybe we're both not, you know, emotional wrecks, that we actually are human, and it's okay, you know, to have feelings, you know, especially when you're covering and dealing and interacting with your own community. And I appreciate you sharing that story, because I think it also shows that we're human. But the sobering part is that sometimes you kind of feel alone, because I almost felt like it was just the two of us, you know, trying to, you know, be a voice for our community, at least in Georgia. But your question about, you know, what more the media can do, Connie, I think, you know, we just have to keep telling our stories. And for those of you who are not in the media, keep pitching and reaching out to us and telling us, you know, you need to be covering this, or if you have an ally in the media, keep pitching the stories. And Connie and I had this really interesting conversation today after I interviewed you, Connie, for a story that I'm doing on CNN later tonight. And she raised such a good point. You know, yes, we have to cover the horror of what's happening within the Asian American community across the country. I mean, this is a story, it must be told, because people need to know about it, and something needs to be done to prevent it, and also, you know, to bring the perpetrators to justice. But you know, I think it's important. I just lost my train of thought there. Sorry. See, this should not happen during a live shot. Communities, the media needs to do. Oh, also focusing on positive stories, right? I mean, that's so important, because we're not just, you don't want to just tick off, okay, the next Asian American was beaten up. Oh, here's another Asian American getting, you know, kicked on the floor. No, that's not our story. You know, we're such a diverse community, and we talk so much how frustrating it is that people see us as a monolith when we have dozens of languages, you know, in Asia that are spoken, and such, I mean, diverse cultures, you know, where we have so much to learn from each other. I have so much to learn from, you know, your culture, Katrina. I mean, you have a beautiful mixed culture from B's culture. So I think, especially as it is AAPI month, it's a month in and where we should be focusing and celebrating our heritage. But I think the more that we talk about who we are, that breaks down barriers, right? It humanizes us. Sadly, we have to talk about humanizing us. But it also breaks down stereotypes. And I think having that kind of conversation and making us visible in the media is important. And for the other communities of color, I think it's important that we support other communities of color, and they support us, so that we all join hands and we become allies in this fight against racism, because we all experience racism, people of color, in different ways. One is not worse or better or more severe than the other. Let's not compare them. You know, because I've had comments where people have diminished my experience, or, you know, have said things to me disparagingly that, you know, what you experience, you know, doesn't compare to what I've been through. And instead of focusing on, you know, comparing which one is worse, let's just accept the fact that, you know, we deal with racism in different ways. We experience America in different ways as people of color, and let's join hands and march together and fight against racism.
Absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. We need to avoid the oppression Olympics. So next question is for Russell. Russell, what are some of the policy recommendations that Stop AAPI Hate is making to address anti-Asian hate?
Yeah, that's a great question. We really do want to get at the roots of racism, so that, you know, we don't want band-aid solutions that aren't necessarily effective. So, you know, Senate just passed the hate crimes bill, and we're thankful for that, because it was almost unanimous, and we're grateful for the leadership of Senator Rona and Congresswoman Meng. But yeah, again, hate crimes are just a small portion of the racism that Asian Americans are experiencing. That's what our data shows. The racism occurs in schools, it's occurring online, it's occurring in businesses, it's occurring in public parks, on public transit. So we need a comprehensive approach to deal with the racism. And so we're calling for maybe three main policy strategies. The first is that we need to educate our communities. We want to stop the crimes before they even occur. And if we educate young people through ethnic studies, we think that promotes ethnic and racial empathy more than the bullying that kids are learning. And we also encourage further civil rights expansion and protection. A lot of the cases are verbal harassment, discrimination, but that's actually impacting Asians in that we're not getting safe access to goods and services. We're being denied public accommodation because we just can't shop safely. And so if people better know about our rights, if the government better enforces it, I think that would cover a lot of the racism we're experiencing. And finally, the hate crime enforcement can criminalize communities of color. It can lead to more incarceration. And we know that doesn't necessarily work. So we're calling for restorative justice models in that we do hold perpetrators accountable. We do want it to stop, but sending them to prison just would continue the cycle of violence. I don't think they learn to become better people. They just become hardened. And so what we want is restorative justice models where the perpetrators learn empathy and that the victims or the targets also get their say and their voice about what has happened to them. So those are our three broad policy approaches we think that get at the roots of racism and would actually break the cycle of violence that we seem to be trapped in.
Great, thank you. Katrina, you are 26 years old, leading an organization with thousands of volunteer chaperones during this pandemic. Tell us how the younger generation of activists approach allyship with other communities of color, as well as approaching what does safety look like in our neighborhoods?
I think the thing about this younger generation is that this younger generation of activists is we have the world at our fingertips. Young people have unlimited access to news stories and images of these violent Asian attacks, Black and brown people getting attacked and killed every day, every week. And social media allows us to share and post and make our voices heard. We saw young activists mobilize Black Lives Matter protests via Twitter and Instagram every day across the country last summer. And now we're seeing similar efforts with Stop Asian Hate rallies and protests. Young people are out here wanting change and demanding justice. And that's where being an ally comes into play. Being an ally means that something doesn't have to happen to you personally in order for you to take it personally. It means recognizing how our lives and futures are intertwined. And when we come together to uplift one another and support one another, we have an even stronger impact to create change. Compassion in Oakland was started by someone who is not of Asian descent. He's actually Mexican American, and our volunteer base is so diverse. When I speak to our volunteers that are not AAPI, I usually ask them why they chose to volunteer with us. And a lot of them answered that this is happening to our community in our backyard. Their courage and compassion to stand with us as allies demonstrates that the basis for building a stronger and safer community. And reimagining safety for all, just as Russell had stated, doesn't mean an increase in policing and law enforcement because these result in high arrest rates and criminalization rates that disproportionately affect Black, Latino, Native American, poor people, and people with disabilities. So I think instead, public safety means creating more community-based initiatives. We're seeing chaperone services come up all over the country, community member-led safety patrols, community ambassadors, community service officers, and organizations like Mental Health First. These are all solutions that seek to invest in the community without perpetuating systemic racism. In order for us to fully promote allyship, it's necessary for us to reimagine public safety solutions for our entire community, including our Black and Brown brothers and sisters.
Great, thank you for that. I'm just trying to imagine our Asian Chinese grannies walking down the street with chaperones who are Black and Latinx and Asian American and a younger generation, and just the visual image is amazing. B, now you've described yourself as a member of the New South, which is a rising coalition of younger Black, Latinx, and Asian American progressives who've turned the tide of the formerly Republican stronghold of Georgia into a battleground state. Tell us why it's important for Asian Americans to work in coalition with other communities of color.
Well, I mean, I think it's incredibly important because one, I think that we're stronger together and we share more in common than we share differences. And at the end of the day, we know that we are up against the same thing, which is battling the system that has excluded all of us. And when we don't stand together to fight for justice, we're all going to lose out. And, it is a generational divide here where we're seeing the younger generation of AAPI folks be much more progressive and also really leaning into our history and understanding that our movements did have solidarity back during the civil rights movement, and really tackling this myth of the model minority and from where it derived and how we begin to unpack all of those things. While also recognizing that we are not a monolith, we're extremely diverse. But at the end of the day, when you look at a state like Georgia, the coalition that we have built here in order to change the political dynamic is because we do believe in justice for everybody. And we do want our families to live in safe communities, have access to healthcare, have access to strong schools. And we don't see that here in the state of Georgia. And so one thing I think is incredibly important as AAPIs is to acknowledge that we have a lot of work to do in our community in terms of battling the anti-Blackness that does occur. One of the challenging things for me is hearing from my friends and my constituents about Asian business owners that go into majority Black neighborhoods and open businesses, but they don't treat their patrons very well. And when I hear those stories, I know that their pain is real and the hurt is real. And how do we begin to have those conversations within our community about how we can do better? And then how can we also help each other educate one another on our different histories and our different stories? Because our history isn't told in America. Asian American history is not taught, it is not told. And because of the disruptive way of our migration, including the Exclusion Act, many of us don't have generations and generations of family members that can tell the history of their stories in America. My family didn't come over here until 1979. So it looks different. We don't have those strong roots where we can pass down those narratives and carry on the legacy in America. But I also see tremendous opportunity in this moment, though painful, right? And also something that I wish didn't have to happen in order for us to have these opportunities for solidarity building and working with each other to heal and working with each other to better understand what's happening in our respective communities. But I will say it's been incredibly important and meaningful to me as an Asian American living in Georgia, for the Legislative Black Caucus, my colleagues, the Georgia NAACP, and my personal friends who reached out immediately after learning about the shooting. And they all said, we know how you feel. We feel your pain. We feel it too often, and we are here for you unequivocally. So I want to always acknowledge that and always acknowledge that, it's my responsibility. I feel like it's my responsibility to call on our community to be there for other communities as well.
Yeah, if I can, I'd like to echo B's comments and Katrina's comments about solidarity. Oakland, Compassion in Oakland, the volunteers are really multiracial. So I've been in Oakland, Chinatown, and it's great for me to see young African Americans posting signs and reading elders. And, the coalition in Georgia is what won the Senate races, right? The Progressive Multiracial Coalition. So B's right. We need each other to work together to address racism and to fight for justice. And then, Connie, you talked about the vision of African Americans escorting seniors. That's what we have in these community ambassador programs. In San Francisco, they have teams of Chinese and African American ambassadors who aren't patrolling and surveilling, but they're actually welcoming people to the community, right? That gives the sense of safety. And these multiracial teams, then, the Chinese ambassador could introduce the grandma to his African American teammate, and the African American teammate can introduce a Black kid to his Chinese partner. So it's not only that vision you were dreaming about, Connie, is actually a reality in San Francisco. And I think it is a good model of solidarity. And in Oakland, I just love our community ambassador program in Oakland. We hire formerly incarcerated prisoners, Asian Americans who come from the community who could speak the language. They get to know the rest, the merchants. But again, they're not patrolling. They're a welcoming group. So when visitors come, they give directions. They organize street cleanups. They serve the unhoused and help them. So they welcome everybody. So I think, like Katrina was talking about, one of our policy approaches is to build on the solidarity that's already there in our communities, and then work together for overall neighborhood safety. Like B said, all of us want safe streets. All of us want to protect our elders. All of us want equal opportunities and educational opportunities. So this solidarity work is just really critical for us to come together, both to develop policies that affect change, but also to change community structures and community connections that we need to feel safe.
Great. Thank you for those additional examples. This question is really open to anyone on the panel. It feels like the violence against Asian Americans is getting worse these days and not better. And I think, Russell, even your recent report and hearing the numbers, it is escalating. And so my question is, what should we be doing right this moment to try to stem this escalation in hate and violence that we're seeing?
Connie, I'll help answer that. Not that I have the answer, but I'm taking some cues off of you and our conversation today. And I think a lot of people have asked me, and I saw a question in the forum where non-Asians or people who are people of color who just support our cause or sympathize or empathize with us are asking, well, what can we do to help, right? And I was going through the 5 Ds. And this was, I think, made up by an organization that's trying to end harassment, all forms of harassment, called Holla Back. And I know that the Asian American Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, you guys are also training people and organizations on how people can intervene or not physically intervene so that you're putting your safety at risk, but ways that you can speak up when people do see verbal harassment against Asian Americans, or really anyone. And I think one of the things was distraction, and how you can, it's kind of a not such a forceful way of intervening, but trying to intervene in a way that distracts the perpetrator away from the attack. So I think advice, or what you guys are doing, your organization is doing, is critical, because I think people want tangible ways and advice on how they can help when they hear our stories.
Yeah, I'd like to quickly add, there's 2 trends. One is the racism that started last year because of fear of the pandemic and the political rhetoric, right? And then we have the other trend of neighborhood violence, especially in low-income communities. And people are conflating the 2 trends, that everything is a hate crime against Asian Americans. And but they're related but separate. And so we need to address both. And I don't think there are quick fixes, really, because, again, both are deeply rooted, historic, institutionalized trends of racism and neighborhood crime. So, and actually, sadly, because we've been in quarantine, I think a lot of that racism against Asian has been suppressed. And so that now that we're coming out of the pandemic, Asians are interacting with the public more, and we are experiencing more racism because we have more interactions. So that might explain the rise that we're seeing now as we come out of the pandemic. People have been angry because they've been in quarantine, because of the economic situation, and because of the political rhetoric. So sadly, I can't say there are quick fixes, that we might actually continue to see that surge of racism and neighborhood violence. I agree with Amara, and that I really acknowledge the great work that Advancing Justice is doing in trying to get people to intervene and to be upstanders, right? And so that's probably the best immediate response, is we all have to stand up and address racism when we see it, whether in person or online. And then we also have to report, because by reporting, then we can document what's happening and come up with better solutions.
And I just want to shout out to your organization, Dr. Russell Jung. Stop AAPI Hate has been on the forefront of this. And honestly, having covered this as a part of the media, and to be able to turn to your organization to report tangible numbers and trends, if we didn't have Stop AAPI Hate, it would be impossible to do this story. So the work that you have been doing with your organization is invaluable, and really, really impactful in how we can report about the trends. Disturbing as it is, they need to be documented. So thank you for your work, Dr. Russell Jung.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from the audience. And again, this is open to everyone, although, so the question is, some media outlets, rhymes with socks, continue to try and spread false information about Asian Americans. What can we do to combat them and dampen their influence and their misinformation?
I feel like I have to answer that because I'm part of the media. So, that's a great question. And I think we all can do something about it because, we all, like Katrina was saying, we all have the power at our fingertips, right? We're all on social media, and so many people get their news via Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you name it. And I think we have to be so socially responsible on what we retweet and what we post, because we do not want to be perpetuating lies. So I think we can, as citizens, we can be involved by, making sure our feed and the things that we are retweeting or reposting are accurate. I think that's where we can start, at least on that human level.
I want to also add something else in, because it's not just that specific media source, but there's something that's happening within the Vietnamese community where there's a lot of misinformation and conspiracy theories that are translated into Vietnamese, and our elderly, older generation folks consume this. And it's through YouTube channels and other means. And they really believe all of these conspiracy theories and this messaging that is essentially regurgitating some of the things that we see on right-wing media. And so it is really dangerous, because the lack of access to in-language material creates a situation where people who speak English as a second language, or people whose primary language they feel more comfortable reading in another language than English, or listening to a broadcast in another language, they're really being taken advantage of, because there are no alternative sources that are doing in-language outreach. And it's, when digging into it, it's a really concerted effort to directly target some of our communities with this misinformation, to sow fear and to, they're sowing fear in the same way that we see with some other Americans. And so it's created this environment where there's such a generational divide because of the media that we consume. And so I don't know how to combat some of those things, but I do think that language access is incredibly important. And when we overlook the necessity of language access, we end up in a space where parts of our community, they're only reading and seeing and listening to things that are translated. And unfortunately, those media sources are the ones pushing the misinformation. There has been a campaign in response called Viet Facts that is a really powerful campaign to try and give our elderlies the truth and try to present facts to dispute some of the things that they're reading and they're consuming. But I think all of us know that when you start this journey of consuming these really emotionally driven, fear-driven, hate-driven sources, it's really hard to get them out of that. And so we are struggling with that in the Vietnamese community. And I know it's not exclusive to just the Vietnamese community, our older generation, that it also affects other AAPI communities. But I mean, it's a really dangerous thing, and it's been really harmful to our families and our communities.
Yeah, B, that's such a good point. I've definitely seen that in other Asian media outlets as well, and on chat groups like WeChat and Kakao, that happens too. So thank you for mentioning that. This has been such an interesting discussion, but unfortunately we are coming to the end of our time.